welcome to our session on the road towards sustainable consumption. My name is Nancy Bocken. I'm a professor in sustainable business at Maastricht University in the Netherlands, and I'm responsible for the Circular X research program on business transitions towards the circular economy, and also the academic lead in the Maastricht York Masters in Sustainable Business. And I will be chairing the session today. So first, this specific event is supported by the York-Maastricht Partnership. So the University of York and Maastricht University have invested into a major strategic partnership that has led to various collaborative activities. And one of these activities is a first joint master's program in sustainable business, which launches this autumn. So we're excited to hear our speakers' ideas about sustainable consumption today. But first of all, a few technical notes. So if you're watching live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button on your screen. So this is available throughout the event, so questions can be asked at any time, and we'll try to answer them after the presentation. And if you have any technical issues, you can rejoin the event using the same link that you had for this one. And please also remember that this event will be recorded, so if you want to have a look back again, you can find us on YouTube afterwards. Subtitles are also available in this event. So to turn these on or off, you can use the CC Live Transcript button at the bottom of your screen. But now back to the content. So I want to introduce you to our speaker today. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to Laura Niessen. So Laura's background is in sustainability sciences and environmental studies, and that has seen her delving into research around circular economy policy in Ireland, as well as working with me on the ERC-funded project Circular X at Maastricht Sustainability Institute. Laura's research aims to investigate how circular economy business models can drive sustainable consumption through sufficiency-based approaches. I'm very delighted to welcome Laura, who will talk us first through her research, and then I will reappear to have some further discussion with her and you as the audience to discuss some further questions. Laura, over to you now.
Thanks very much, Nancy. Thank you for the kind introduction. And I hope nobody was scared off by the amount of very big words in what I'm trying to research. I'm scared off a bit. So let's see if I can share my slides with you. There we go. Yeah, so today I'd like to talk to you about sustainable consumption, why we need it, but also specifically what is the role that business can play in driving sustainable consumption. And maybe just to dive straight into why we need sustainable consumption. We have a few things on this picture here that on the one hand, you can see top left corner is the planetary boundaries. We know that in 9 certain areas that scientists have looked into, they wanted to assess, are we actually within the capacity of the planet? Are we over it? And we know, unfortunately, for climate change, biodiversity, land system change, and biochemical flows, we are already taking more than the planet can carry. So we know that there's a good few environmental issues related to that. And maybe just for a very specific example, biodiversity. We know that since the 1970s, species on average have reduced by 68% in population size. So that means in 50 years, we've seen that species across the globe, animal species have shrunk to approximately 1/3 of the population that they would have been in the 70s, which is obviously quite a stark number. These environmental issues are also linked to our well-being, our social well-being. So we know that 1/4 of humanity at the moment is already living with food insecurity. If we continue going down the road of more biodiversity loss and climate change, obviously that could be worsened. Similarly, around or over 1 billion people are already experiencing water insecurity. So also something that obviously we want to look at. So where do we want to be? These are problems, but where would we like to be? What is the vision of the future that we would like to see? And here I'd like to borrow the donut that Kate Raworth has developed. We can see the planetary boundaries from the outer layer. So what I just talked about, the area that we don't want to cross, we want to stay within the safe zone of what the Earth can carry. But we also want to add another layer, which is the social foundation. We really want to make sure that people also have a nice life, have a good life. They have access to enough food, to enough water. They also have, however, political equality, voice, justice. So how do we get into this in-between space where as many people as possible, ideally everyone, of course, has a nice life, secure life, just life, without crossing the planetary boundaries? Just on a little sideline, there's actually an event with Kate on this Friday talking about donut economics. So I would definitely recommend, if you have time, to listen into what Kate says about her work as well. Now, how do we get there? How do we get people to a state where they are safe, they are well fed, but also not crossing what we know are the boundaries that the Earth actually has? And specifically, I want to talk about what companies can do, because that isn't necessarily something that is oftentimes looked at. A very common response that companies have to sustainability is efficiency. And I think efficiency is a very intuitive, for most of us, concept. Everybody, I think, has heard of energy efficient light bulbs. You can turn on your lights for the same amount of time, you use fewer resources, less energy. So in that sense, it's very good for sustainability. Similarly, we have efficiency for cars, for instance. So we can have fuel efficient cars. You drive the same amount, you need fewer fuels, less gas, you also produce less greenhouse gases. So in that sense, efficiency can really help for saving resources. It can do that with a business by implementing efficiency in the own production. You can also produce efficient items, services, products. However, there is a limitation to efficiency that we're well aware of, and specifically science also is very, very vocal about, and that is called the rebound effect. So any kind of benefits that we get from these efficiency innovations might be offset. And I like the picture here because it shows two ways, it gives two examples of what can happen. So if I buy a fuel efficient car, it is now cheaper for me to drive to work and back every day. I need less fuel, so it doesn't cost as much. I save money, so I might actually go and spend that money on something I've wanted to do for a long time, which could be flying to Spain on a holiday. It's great for me, but obviously offsets any kind of carbon emission saves that I had beforehand. It also uses more energy again, so it offsets, it rebounds the initial energy efficiency. Similarly, I could also say, well, now it's actually cheaper for me to run my car, to drive, so I might drive further. And this is something that doesn't always happen to 100%. It doesn't always offset to 100%, but a lot of efficiency measures have some form of rebound effect that we need to be aware of. So what is another way that businesses can work towards sustainability? You might have heard of the circular economy, and this Ellen MacArthur diagram called the butterfly diagram really shows what this concept is meant to be. It's about keeping materials and products in use for as long as possible by circling them back. And it has two parts to it for two different kinds of items and materials. On the left-hand side, we see the biological cycle, which is items that can actually be composted and returned to the biosphere, usually around food, for instance. And for that, we want to make sure that it goes through production and consumer, but after use, it can be cascaded. So it can be used, for instance, for compost or for anaerobic digestion to get biogas. And we can get as much use out of it as possible before then returning it back to the earth, where it can be biodegraded. On the right side, you see the mechanical cycle, the mechanical loop, and that is for any kind of materials that we can't return to earth. It might be the likes of metals or plastics, they aren't biodegradable. So for those, the idea is that we keep products in use as long as possible. We want the products to be reused, repaired. We give them second and third lives. We want them to be refurbished. And if all else fails, we can take them apart and use the components, recycle the materials, and make new products with them. So for a company, the circular economy can take a lot of different ways. If you're on the biological cycle, you might take somebody else's waste. So you could take stale bread and turn it into beer. That's actually being done by a good few companies. Also, I think some in the UK. And the mechanical cycle, you can really try to make sure that people use things as much as possible through, for instance, sharing or rental. You can make sure that things can be repaired, they can be reused, given a second, third life. And you can also make sure that things are repairable, recyclable. But in addition to all these things that companies can do, there are also limitations to the circular economy, in that it doesn't always question how much is being consumed. So we see both in efficiency and in the circular economy, which are two very important and relevant principles or ways business can work, they don't really question how much we're consuming. And the issue with that is that we know, and the environmental scientific community generally acknowledges, that the consumption, especially of affluent, rich households worldwide, is by far the strongest determinant and accelerator of environmental and social impact. So we know that how we consume, and especially consuming ever more, is what drives a lot of the environmental and social problems that we have. Now, obviously, a lot of the consumption that we do is important. We need our food, we need our housing, we need our shelter, clothing. So that is something that cannot be questioned. However, there's also another side to our consumption in affluent societies that might be considered unnecessary, or if you want to put it into the words of Tim Jackson, economist Tim Jackson, it can be us being persuaded to spend money we don't have on things we don't need, to create impressions that won't last on people we don't care about. Now, that obviously is an exaggeration. I doubt that most of our consumption is based on that, but it shows the problem that we have, that we don't only consume what we actually need in affluent societies. We oftentimes also consume a lot of what we want, which might in its turn have environmental and social impacts. And there is research from last year from Oxfam and the Stockholm Environment Institute that wanted to understand, what does this consumption do for our greenhouse gas emissions and the carbon budget that we have if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees global warming, but also looking at who's responsible for this. So whose emissions mainly, or whose consumption mainly drives these emissions. And the gray area and the black area are the richest 10 and 1% of the world. So the richest 10% of the world are responsible for more than half the emissions through consumption since the 1990s. I think it's nice to put that into context. The richest global 10% obviously means something else depending on where you are. So rich globally would count if you earn more than £26,000 a year. You are part of the richest 10% globally, and you are part of that group that consumes 52% of our emissions. The main reasons for these high emissions are the way we move, our transport, the way we live, our housing and how we heat it, what we eat, our food, and also our manufactured products. So that is anything from, say, your phone, your laptop, decorations in your house, over to clothing. And just to give an example, we know that from 2000 to 2015, within 15 years, the production of clothing doubled worldwide. So the amount of clothing that was produced in 2000 was doubled 15 years after, because of developments such as fast fashion, where things are worn for a lot shorter amount of time, are thrown away quite quickly, and especially are bought at a very fast rate, oftentimes because they are also affordable, very affordable. Another thing I think is interesting to look at this graph is the bright green area, which is the global middle class. And I think it's also really important to note that from the 2000s onwards, the global middle class has started catching up, has started emitting a lot more through consumption as well, because that's a big middle class aiming to have the same kind of lifestyle that they see in the richest 1 and 10%. So I think this is a very notable thing. If we want to stay within our carbon budget, we need to make sure that the consumption stays within what is feasible, because we cannot have the consumption levels that we see in the richest 10% by the global middle class and stay within our carbon budget. So starting with this maybe slightly dire introduction of, well, consumption isn't good. We need sustainable consumption. What is sustainable consumption actually? Why is it something that we should consider? Well, sustainable consumption, to stay within the Earth boundaries, in fairness, actually means for a lot of the affluent society to reduce consumption of overall resources. Level consumption or reduce it. That doesn't mean individually, but the society has to make sure that fewer resources are consumed. Sufficiency is a specific principle for that. It's the idea that you have enough, but not too much. And it's quite intuitive for most people because you wouldn't eat more than you need. If you're hungry, you eat, but only to a certain extent, because after that you are full. And if you continue eating, you might get sick. So it's a very intuitive principle that we try to find this sweet spot again, similar to the donut, where you are well, your well-being is fostered, but you do not have too much either. And some people say, well, sufficiency is trying to find a balance between excess and emptiness. And you could also say it's having enough for a healthy and meaningful life, but without excess. That is a very nice principle. So how can business support that? And Nancy and her colleague Sam Short have said, well, it could mean that businesses encourage consumers to make do with less. I would like to rephrase that. I would say it should be encouraging consumers to not overconsume while providing alternatives, because businesses can play a big role in providing alternatives. I might want to live sustainably, but my washing machine is broken. Well, I can't get spare parts. Maybe they aren't repaired anymore. I can't repair it myself, but to have it repaired actually costs more than to get a new one. So it's not a real alternative for me to use my broken washing machine. I actually might consume more. I might get more because there's no alternative. Or a company can provide a very viable alternative if they put car sharing in my neighborhood. I now might not need my own personal car, or my family might not need the second car that we have, because there's a car sharing alternative. So in that sense, the business sufficiency alternatives are very much related to the circular economy as well. It's about offering repair or reuse, offering sustainable products, making products durable, giving them a long life, sourcing them locally if possible, or for instance, with a lot of reduced packaging. The whole idea of access over ownership, so rental or leasing. Why is it more sustainable to rent, say, a drill? And that's a very common example because it's widely talked about that the average drill doesn't get a use time of more than 20 minutes during its lifetime. So if you own a drill, you won't use it more than 20 minutes over years, over decades. The question then is, why don't we share a drill between 15 or 20 households or more so that it gets more use out of it? And there's no need to produce the individual 15 or 20 drills that every household would have. That is what I have been working on, the kind of ideas that, or the kind of ways that businesses can drive sustainability, drive sufficiency. This is a framework. I won't go into all of the options, but just to give you a very brief overview, on the left-hand side, there's 4 different dimensions of how we can support the sustainable consumption. The first is less stuff, less clutter, but also really looking into only having materials in things that are needed, so simplifying products. We can also look at less speed, making things for longer lifetimes, making them more reliable, making sure that they don't become obsolete after a while. We can look into less distance. If we are able to source things locally or regionally, the transport emissions obviously are reduced. We can also look into less market, which is a slightly unusual one for business maybe, but as a business, if you help your customers repair their things, or if you provide spare parts so that they can do it themselves, if you provide training so that they can maybe start developing products themselves. That is all something that can be a strategy for the business to support their customers in living more sustainably. And these we have then, Nancy and I have then clustered in kind of 3 steps, 3 ways the business can talk to the consumer, saying, well, you should rethink your consumption, you should do it differently. You should reduce your consumption, you should consume less, or you should refuse consumption. You should really think about not consuming, not buying, not selling. And this is a nice theory, but then the question is, do businesses actually do that? Especially for the last one, saying, why would a business or would a business actually say, don't consume? The answer is yes, there are businesses doing this. And those businesses have oftentimes recognized that resources are limited and we need to be aware of how we consume nowadays. Just to give a few examples, starting on the top left there. Vitsu is based in the UK, they're furniture manufacturers. And they say in this tweet here, we do not do sales because our products never become obsolete. We can always expand and modify your Vitsu shelves, so we will not give you price reductions. We also have KLM below it, a very unusual example, the Royal Dutch Airlines saying, well, maybe if you're going on a short distance between Amsterdam and Brussels, don't fly with us, take the train, because it's not only more sustainable, it's also actually quicker. We have the center top there, German supermarket bio company saying more than enough is too much and less meat does not taste less delicious in their advertisement in the supermarkets to make people aware that if you buy more than you actually will eat, it will become waste and it will also be wasted resources. You might have seen the Don't Buy This Jacket campaign by Patagonia. That was put into the New York Times in 2011, and it was intended to make their customers aware that they do not need to buy this jacket if they already have a perfectly functioning jacket at home. Unfortunately, you could say it led to increased sales of this jacket because customers or people that saw the ad thought it was such a cool idea to question consumption that they went and buy the jacket. So that's something to discuss. But we saw last year, for instance, Patagonia put the ad on the right-hand side there into the New York Times saying, buy less, demand more climate action. So Patagonia has been very vocal in trying to raise awareness of, do we actually need to buy that much? And these are just the communications that companies can put out there. So what would a business model look like? What would a business look like that supports sustainable consumption? And I will actually start with Patagonia because they are a very common example for that, and they are very outspoken in their work towards sustainable consumption. If you don't know them, they are an outdoor gear and clothing brand. They're originally US-based, but I think most of the Patagonia stores are, well, Patagonia is available worldwide in most countries now. The products they have are designed for durability. They are meant to be worn for a long time. They are meant to be repairable. And they also insured or warranted with what they call the ironclad guarantee for repairs. So for a lot of years after you buy it, you can return your product and have it repaired with them. In addition, Patagonia runs the Worn Wear program, which means you can trade in your items and receive store credit. And then they use these traded items either to fix them if needed and clean them and then resell them as secondhand, or they remanufacture them and then turn them into new items. Patagonia also has care and repair guides where people can look at tutorials, watch videos online to know how to fix their own zips or little holes so that they don't have to send anything into the warranty program. Maybe it's also not covered anymore. Trying to help people fix things themselves if they can. They used to have several vans on the road going around the world offering free repairs in outdoor sports locations. That's not currently the case because of COVID, but I reckon they will take that up again afterwards. And interestingly, these free repairs weren't just for Patagonia gear. You could go there with any kind of gear and they would repair it for free in order to spread the message that you really should be able to use your things for longer if it just requires a small repair. They're also very outspoken in their communication about, as we can see, buying less, demanding more, and they are quite heavy on activism for sustainability. Then another example of what a business could do in an entirely different sector would be Vitsu, which we also had on the previous slide there with the quotes. Vitsu are based in the UK, in Royal Leamington Spa, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. They are design furniture manufacturers, and the ethos is living better with less that lasts longer. So very much about the idea of sufficiency, having a good life, but with the things that you need that last a long time. And in order to do that, Vitsu furniture is designed for modularity. So it can actually be changed. You can add components and take them away as needed. You can repair them for a long time, and they are meant to be durable. This idea of modularity and repairability is coupled with a lifelong service program. So you can send in your things for repair, you can send in your things for reupholstering, but also when you move from one house to the next, you can get in touch with the Vitsu team and they will talk to you about your needs. Oh, I'm moving into a smaller place now, so I don't actually need as much. Or I'm moving into a bigger house now, so I need a few more units. And you can accordingly change your furniture to the needs that you have. And in that, Vitsu is also quite unique, you could almost say, because they really try to sell you only what you need. And their staff are trained internally and told, do not sell people more than they need. The staff do not receive commission for sales. The company does not give price reductions. And it's the whole aim of making sure that if people have what they need, that's good. If they need more, they can always come back. So we do not want to oversell, we only want to sell what they need. And the idea in the longer time is to sell less to more customers that will then use it for longer. So instead of selling more to some customers, the idea of sufficiency of only buying what you need is spread to more customers that can use things for a long lifetime. Vitsu has very limited advertisement, usually through word of mouth and recommendations, and is doing very well, is thriving because customers are so happy with both the product and the service. But the advertisement, again, is limited to make sure that people do not just buy things because they see them in an ad and think, oh, that looks like a lovely armchair. They're actually meant to consider the purchase and really need the product. Then another example of sufficiency business, again from the UK, but in the food sector, is Oddbox. I don't know if you're aware of Oddbox, but it is a delivery, it's a company that provides deliveries of fruit and vegetable boxes with produce that would have otherwise been wasted. It could be fruit or veg that was too large, too small, slightly oddly shaped. It could also be perfectly fine, ideally grown vegetables and fruits that have just been produced as surplus, because that's a common enough farming practice that you produce a certain amount of surplus in case not everything that you grow actually turns out right. So what they do is they offer a weekly or bi-weekly delivery of boxes, and they work together with farmers, mostly British, trying to rescue food and bring it to the consumers. So you get a box every week or every other week, and you have no idea what will be in it. It is literally just things that would have gone to waste otherwise that week. And in order to not only rescue that food, but also for people to be more aware and to foster conscious consumption, as Oddbox calls it, they also put recipes into the boxes. So you might have some kind of parsnip that you've never seen before. You have no idea what you could cook with it, how you would eat it. So they also try to educate people on ways to use different kinds of fruit and veg, but also use everything to, again, reduce the waste that is there. And in addition, you also get individual feedback. So Oddbox provides feedback about the impact that your box has. You have now had this box with these ingredients this week. That means you have saved this much water and energy because this food hasn't gone to waste. So again, it's very much about the communication to the consumer, as we've also seen with, for example, Patagonia. The final example I wanted to share with you is based in the Netherlands, Homey. And Homey provide washing machines, also fridges and I think laundry dryers, but I'm focusing on the washing machines here, It's a rental service and you get full service, free installation, it's delivered to your house, full repair, no upfront costs, and you pay for your washing machine usage by wash. So every time you wash your laundry, you pay a certain price, and that is coupled to the temperature at which you wash. So if you wash a cold wash, which requires less energy input, you only pay 70 cents. However, if you decide you wash at a warmer temperature at 60 degrees, you pay more than double the price because you are now using more energy and more resources. So by paying for every wash and by paying according to temperature, people are incentivized to think about every time they wash, do I actually need to wash this? And do I have to wash it that warmly? And you get a monthly usage overview as a customer telling you how much you washed, at which temperature, and also how much you washed the week before, the month before, and how you could maybe improve it if you need to maybe not wash every other week and not wash at 60 degrees. There's some research on Homey that has looked at what that means, how people react to that kind of rental service. And it shows that actually it does mean that people reduce the number of washes they do and the laundry temperature. So it does already, we can see, impact how people use the laundry machine. These are obviously just 4 examples of what businesses can do. Maybe there's a few that you have that you can think of. Feel free to maybe pop them in the Q&A as well, if you can form them into a question. But yeah, what do we learn from these 4 businesses and from the framework that we have seen earlier? What can we take away from this, for instance, for companies? Well, on the one hand, I would say selling fewer things does not necessarily equal less profit. We just saw 3 out of those 4 companies selling fewer things and being perfectly economically sustainable. So looking at the things, the options of rental or leasing, offering product as a service rather than the product itself, can be a very valid alternative to selling more things for business. But also, if you want to, you can go as far as not having sales, not having price reductions, limiting your marketing. And in conversation with these companies, it's been really clear, or they've very clearly said that as long as you are honest with your customers about why you do it, this creates a lot of trust, and people will come back to you as return customers because they think you're doing the right thing and they would like to support it. If you offer these alternatives, it has to be easy and it has to be desirable. So people will want to buy those things or use those things that you offer. It shouldn't really be more expensive or much more expensive than your normal average conventional product. And it shouldn't feel like they're sacrificing anything. It should be the easy go-to option that they can choose. If you can, try to focus on long lifetimes, provide repair, reuse, a second life to items. And also local or regional sourcing is very impactful in terms of limiting the emissions that are created during the production. You can support sufficiency beyond the market, although that is maybe the more unusual option. So again, if you do provide repair guides or if you provide tutorials on how people can do things themselves, that really has shown to connect people, connect customers to the business and to create trust and create the idea that, yeah, this business is really trying to do something for sustainable consumption for the right reasons. And that links to the last point, talk about it openly, because as a business, you might get questions about greenwashing. So be honest, be open about why you do it, what you do, but also very much what you cannot do, because there might be some kind of regulations in place that limit you from doing certain things that you would like to do for sustainability. And everybody, no matter whether they work in a company or in academia or anywhere else, we're all customers to a certain extent. So what can we all do? And the very obvious answer, of course, is reflect on what you buy. If you want to go buy something, ask yourself, do I really need this? If you think you do, then sure, can you find a sustainable alternative for it? Try to check the credentials of businesses when you buy with them. is this really sustainable? But this is also a difficult thing sometimes. So your packaging might say 97% recycled plastic in this packaging, but that doesn't reflect what is inside it. So if it's not sure, if you can't really tell from the different labels, feel free to ask. Just get in touch with the business and say, what do you do for sustainability? And also tell them what would you like them to do for sustainability, because businesses rely on customer feedback. So feel free, or don't be scared to reach out on social media and the customer support to actually ask them. If you do find businesses like the four that I talked about that you think are doing great work, talk about it. Tell your friends. Maybe there's some of your friends or family that are interested in it and would like to know about these kind of initiatives. As I said, Vitsu very much lives through word of mouth, or advertises through word of mouth very successfully, because people are so happy with the product and service that they get. And all of this, us changing, people individually changing the consumption, and businesses offering alternatives, is very important, but it can only do so much as long as there's not a level playing field, as long as there's some subsidies for more harmful activities, and businesses that want to do the right thing do not have the same kind of level playing field. So also don't be afraid to demand change from your representatives if you think that is something that you would want to see supported by them. Now, I hope I've given you all some food for thought, maybe some new ideas at the York Festival of Ideas. And I think Nancy will join me back now, and we will have a little chat and look at the Q&A.
Thank you, Laura. That was really exciting. So thank you for giving us the overview and starting a little bit with the drama, but also giving us hope that things will be all right as long as we choose the right businesses and also think a bit more carefully ourselves about how we consume. First, I wanted to ask more of an open question before I go to the Q&A. But I'm not sure whether you can really answer this one. But I was thinking about the sectors. So you mentioned in the beginning, like, yeah, in certain sectors, we need to think a little bit more carefully. Are there sectors that are more appropriate for sufficiency, and which ones are maybe not appropriate at all, and we need to leave it to legislation?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll try to answer as best as I can. I think the idea of sufficiency is appropriate in all sectors, but to very different extents. So obviously, if you look at the electronics sector, you can produce products that are durable, that are long lasting. You can maybe look into sharing and the like. But if you look at food, how do you say you need to consume less? That doesn't really work. It's important for food, for instance, to look at what you consume, that you consume things that are low on resources. I think a very difficult one is housing, because obviously a lot of the impact that housing has is based on how big your house is, where it is, how you get to certain areas. It's linked as well to your transport. But if you cannot afford a house that is close by to your job or your supermarket, you do not really have the option to live a more sustainable life unless you feel free to cycle 1.5 hours to work every day. So I think, yeah, to a large extent, it's also really about linking it in with policies that make such life possible.
Yeah, there are trends like the tiny houses, but can we force everyone to live in a tiny house? I'm not sure whether that's appropriate at this stage.
Exactly.
I do see a question also related to banning things. For instance, this particular question: in the long term, widespread personal vehicle ownership doesn't appear to be compatible with significant decarbonization. Cars create very large emissions during construction. Do we need to abandon cars altogether? What is your view on this with your business sufficiency hat on?
Yeah, I think with my business sufficiency hat on, I don't know if we need to abandon cars altogether. I don't think we will in the short term. So in the short term, we will definitely have to use cars because we do not have the structure, as I just said, to transport ourselves, use the mobility without cars. In the long term, I think if we have the ability to use fewer cars, to only use them when it's needed, to have the likes of shared cars where you only use it when you actually need it, and ideally, obviously, have an alternative fuel source. So, for instance, electric cars, that is one option. I don't know how far we would get with saying we have to abandon all cars, because there will be things, for instance, ambulances. How do you can't really change that to a train or a bike. So for a certain way, maybe we will need new innovation in that regard.
So then it might be the alternatives in your framework. So also legislation is coming up for electric cars. So in some cases, at least temporarily, we need alternatives rather than abandoning it altogether. That would be your view on that.
Yeah.
I also saw a question I accidentally typed that I would answer it live, but I will do it anyway. So it was Christine mentioning Fairphone, and I basically wanted to say that in our project that Laura and I work on, we already discovered Fairphone and wrote a case study on them. So we've been in contact with them. So we'll type the URL in the link as well.
Great
of the
example.
Circular X project, but it's a great example both doing the circular and the social side of sustainability. And they were also, I think, trialing all kinds of take-back models, so the phone could be refurbished and reused by the next person as well. So that's really exciting. I don't know whether this is a good one or a difficult one to take on, but this is a question by an anonymous person. May I ask a question about religion? Can religion help with sustainable consumption?
Interesting. I think it can, if religion promotes sustainable consumption. So we know for some religious groups, there are quite well, how do you say that there's a lifestyle of frugality, so of prudence. And that is something that obviously by itself supports sustainable consumption. Now we have to be aware that not everybody is religious. So obviously it's not the only way we can promote sustainable consumption. But yeah, I think there definitely is a way for religion and religious communities to influence, especially also as we've seen, for instance, with COVID and vaccinations, there were some communities that were worried about getting the vaccinations until they saw their religious leaders getting them. So I think there's definitely this potential of inspiration and of getting people interested or aware of the consequences of their consumption.
Yeah, so there might be a way for religious leaders to also get involved. I know at least the Pope is also in the discussions on climate change, and there are at the religious level already discussions on how they could get more involved. So I think it's definitely a good question and a good idea. Should we go to the next question by Beverly? Rapid and unsustainable consumption often occur because people lack knowledge about its environmental implications. Do you think immediate economic measures should be taken, or is it more important to educate politicians or the public?
Both. This isn't, I think we can see already in the younger populations with the Fridays for Future and the like, and also here teaching bachelor students at university, I can really see that the education, the environmental education they have received over the last few years has very much made them aware of it. But obviously we cannot educate everyone that easily. So there are ways, in a sense, maybe to make it easier for people. There's work on labels. How do we know, if we look at something, what the environmental impact of it is? And I think there's currently a lot of labels, but they are one way of helping the everyday person when they're just having worked a full day, go into the supermarket and want to do their shopping and don't want it to be difficult. That can be an easier way for people to just see the answer to what is the sustainable product here.
So this is about the alternatives, and I think also that will be in Kate Raworth's session on the 11th of June. It's also more about the macroeconomic picture, like rethinking what we're optimizing. So we're not maybe optimizing GDP, the gross domestic product, or the economic impact, but also thinking about what are we doing for society and the environment. So it's also about different things of measurements that we might have to educate politicians on, but that will also be part of Kate Raworth's session on the 11th. So this is also a good question, I guess. How significant are these changes made by small companies when big firms create a high percentage of global emissions? So we're talking about the startups versus the big multinationals in the world.
Yeah, very, very true. And I think that was related to the last point in what we can all do, demanding change. So yes, these companies do have an influence. We can see it, for instance, Patagonia isn't that small, and a lot of the other outdoor brands are now starting to talk about secondhand and repair because they see that this has a positive connotation with customers. So Patagonia's initial work on that is forcing other outdoor brands to go down the same route. We also know that secondhand resale or rental are very much booming. It's a market that the bigger companies are now realizing also creates value and creates benefits for them. But one of my colleagues the other day said, can we ever have an Amazon of sustainability? And that is maybe another question. Is there a place for big corporations that sell everything very easily accessible at very low prices, potentially with bad social conditions behind it? And that is, I think, something that politics also needs to be able to constrain if that is something that we don't want.
Again, it might be a role for the politicians if they listen carefully then. So there was a question by Andrea, and I can partly answer that already. Like, is there an example of sustainable consumption in the shoe sector? So in the chat box, we already mentioned the Circular X case database, and there's at least 2 examples, like Emma Safety Footwear. So they have footwear as a service, so they also give maintenance services as part of the package, and sort of a refurbishment option as well. So there's already quite a few things happening there, but that's quite specialist. So that's safety shoes. And the other example is Adidas, and they recently launched a rental platform in France for outdoor gear, basically, and equipment. But I'm not sure whether it specifically features shoes as well. But there are some emerging examples. So I'm not sure whether Laura has come across more specific ones than the ones in the database, but these are already some examples.
The only other one that I can think of are, I think they're called Chaco shoes. They're sandals, and they're very much designed, again, for repairability and have a long lifetime warranty. So I think it's around 5 or 10 years. But really the cases that Nancy mentioned as well are great examples of that.
Yeah, so I think we get an interest in the different types of sectors. So yeah, you already mentioned Vitsu, a furniture company, as an example. So basically, Christopher is asking about modular systems and interchangeability. So yeah, in the IT world, JPEG and standards like that are quite rare. So why are so few genuinely generic products, so few PCs versus Apples? Okay, so it's more about standardization, I guess. That's the question. I know legislation is coming up in the circular economy package, so that would be the legislation answer, right? So I'm not sure whether there's a company example as well, Laura.
I can't really think of one, but I think I will try to answer your question now. I don't know if that is what you're asking, but the reason Vitsu is rare and the reason modularity doesn't necessarily mean you can interlink it with others is because companies want to keep their customers. At the moment, the main model is for one company to sell their products to as many people as possible, as much as possible. So they have no interest in linking in with other companies. They do not want to detract from their own sales. And I think that is, again, we've said, also the role of policy in order to enable, and maybe even to a certain extent to drive companies to be compatible with others, because that would make life a lot easier for customers and potentially only detract to a minor extent for the business.
Yes, I think it might be happening with things like chargers, mobile phone chargers and other types of chargers.
Yeah,
USB. So I think some things are happening also in the IT sector, but yeah, always not quick enough, I guess. And I think also IKEA is looking into spare parts, and also the fact that you can more easily disassemble things. And there's a lot of things happening in the area of modularity as well. And I think Apple also has a robot that can disassemble. So they can assemble, but also disassemble the same product. So to dismantle and recover materials and components. So we get a question on the carbon budget. So whether it's useful. So there was apparently a recent study from your council that that the carbon budget is about 50 tons of CO2 per person, the remaining carbon budget. Is this a useful concept? So there's already the book, How Bad Are Bananas? The carbon footprint of everything, basically. So that sort of calculates that we should stay under, I thought it was even 1 ton of CO2 per person. So 50 sounds like a lot, but maybe that's over a lifetime. So what is your view? Should we have a personal carbon budget, Laura? And then we can sort of decide how we spend it, either on a nice car or flights or fancy food, but we cannot do everything.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think I might know the report that is being referred to here, which looked into especially also the impact of flying. I think it was talked about in The Guardian. I think it's good to know your carbon budget, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to act on it at the moment, obviously, because we don't know, unless we have read How Bad Are Bananas, we don't know what the impact is of certain things. So again, I think especially for enable people to have a good life, not to make it feel like they're sacrificing. It should be the way of offering the alternatives rather than constraining what they do. If we do have to go for a carbon budget in the end because we are just consuming crazily and we do not stop, then we also have to be really careful to make sure that it's just, because on the one hand, obviously people like me sitting in the Netherlands in a comfortable apartment, I use a lot more carbon than somebody who lives in a shared house with their whole family, maybe 5 other people, and barely makes a living. So it really has to be adjusted as well to make sure that everybody gets to a certain standard of living without making sacrifices in a sense.
But it might help then that scientists would put down like what is the carbon impact. There was a study by Lund University as well. It was not a very favorable study. I think the worst things we could do from a carbon emissions perspective was to have children and pets, followed by taking flights or something. So it was it appeared in the Guardian and other newspapers because it had an interesting story, but it did make people aware of where their biggest impacts are. So so there are definitely studies emerging on that topic, and more of that will come, I guess. So there's a question by an anonymous person. When more sustainable options are often more expensive, how do we ensure that that accessibility for everyone? So the risk seems to be that the rich buy too much sustainable stuff in an unsustainable way, and poorer people choose less sustainable options because it's either all they can afford or what they can afford more quickly. So yeah, this is more about the different business models that make it more affordable, I guess, to everyone. I think you have some examples in there, but yeah, maybe you can give some examples from a business perspective, what we can do to make it more affordable.
So on a business perspective, the affordability is particularly prominent in sharing or rental models. So that's a lot of things that can be handy for people that do not have the option to afford sustainable products. But I really agree with the comment, because it should not be something that only the educated middle class upwards can afford. It should be something that actually is available to everyone. And even the likes of bike renting in inner cities has often been criticized for only being used by rich white males. So it's something that we really need to be aware of. The idea is not to get the rich people to buy sustainable products, more sustainable products. They are meant to buy less. And then hopefully, ideally, these products are actually available. If you need them, they are available to all kinds of income classes. And it's difficult to get there, but it's also related to the culture we have of copying, in a sense, the consumption that we see. Oh, my neighbor has 2 cars, so maybe I should have 2 cars. my neighbor has the new Apple iPhone, or my child has loads of classmates that now have the new Apple iPhone. So now my child needs the new Apple iPhone. It's really about trying to find a way to create value and well-being and meaning in our society that isn't based on materials, which is a big quest, but also something that Kate Raworth talks about. So maybe, again, for you also an interesting talk to sit in there on Friday.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. And you already mentioned also education and maybe also starting from a young age. There's a specific question whether there's a suitable site to start when you're a kid, maybe to learn about sufficiency. And maybe it's a niche that hasn't been addressed yet. So maybe our site could be made more suitable for kids as well.
Yeah, I have to admit, I'm not very familiar with educational sites. I assume this is websites.
Probably, yeah.
No, I wouldn't really know any specifically for sufficiency, but I think school curricula are actually working towards implementing environmental education to a larger extent. So that's a good positive change. And if you're interested in sufficiency, I can have a look. I do not, unfortunately, know any website that I can think of for kids at the moment, but maybe we'll start one.
Yeah, we can start a subsidiary of our own website. I think it's a nice but very important niche, I guess, to address. I think I will do one more question because I think we're running out a little bit, and maybe people can follow up also with the contact details. But I think it's maybe a good, nice and broad question to also end with, although it's a difficult one. What further can be done on the consumer behavior side? Sorry for this broad question.
I like how it's already apologized for the broad question. Yeah, I think that is really related to the culture that we have of consumption. And this is a difficult one to answer, but ideally we shouldn't have only, how do I say that, only the maybe eco warriors want to promote sustainable consumption. We should have sustainable consumption that is easy for everyone. And maybe a silly example, but I know that my parents never cycled and they have now gotten electric bikes and they don't stop cycling. They barely take their car anymore because it's actually very comfortable and it requires a lot less work than it would have required to cycle. So I think this is what I mean with the alternatives. We need to make sure that it's something people can easily access and that is interesting for them, that easily slots into their life and doesn't require a large sacrifice.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to end it, and also talk about the different generations and how they might address the behaviors in a different way. So maybe if we start with education from a young age onwards, we don't have to re-educate people as well. Yeah. So I think that might also be a good conclusion. But first of all, thank you, Laura, for also answering all these questions of great variety. And I think it was a great discussion. It stimulated a lot of debate. We could unfortunately not address all questions within the time frame, but maybe later on, we can still address them if people contact us via the email addresses. So the recording will be available on the York Festival of Ideas website. So it's already in the chat box where you can find it. And we very much hope that you will also attend some of the other sessions that you can find on the York Festival of Ideas website. And so I would like to thank everyone for participating. I would like to thank everyone for also engaging with this challenging and interesting topic. And I very much want to thank Laura again for her participation. And I also want to alert you to the next session. So tomorrow there will also be a talk on the Global South. So it will be on climate change and conservation with Professor Raf de Bond from Maastricht University and Professor Henrika Altek from York University. But thank you very much for participating, and I look forward to meeting you at some point live in the future as well. Thank you.